What happens when safety replaces risk? At first, it feels like relief. The shocks are smaller. The failures are contained. The panic never fully arrives. Safety does exactly what it promises. But over time, something quieter begins to change. The system stops asking what could be gained and starts asking only what could be lost. To understand why this moment matters, we have to return to a phase when protection became the dominant objective. After learning how to prevent collapse, institutions reoriented themselves around preservation. Avoiding downside became more important than pursuing upside. Risk was no longer a tool. It was a threat. This shift altered decision-making at every level. Capital flowed toward certainty. Models rewarded predictability. Long-term bets gave way to incremental advances that could be justified immediately. Safety became the metric of success, and success became smaller, steadier, and less transformative. The early signs were subtle. Fewer bold investments, more conservative balance sheets. Innovation slowed not because creativity vanished, but because tolerance did. Ideas were evaluated not for potential impact, but for their ability to survive scrutiny. The future was filtered through the lens of caution. The reveal began here. Risk had not disappeared. It had been pushed to the margins. And when risk is excluded from the center, it reemerges elsewhere, less visible, less regulated, and harder to control. The system looked safer, but it was also narrowing its field of vision. Safety replacing risk felt responsible. It felt mature, but it also carried an unintended consequence. It reduced the system's capacity to adapt to change. When uncertainty is avoided rather than explored, resilience becomes static. The conflict was forming quietly. A system built to protect itself was becoming less willing to evolve. And evolution, by definition, requires exposure. The question was no longer how to avoid danger. It was how to move forward without it. And that question would not remain theoretical for long. As safety became the guiding principle, the system's relationship with uncertainty shifted. Decisions were no longer framed around possibility, but around avoidance. What once felt like prudent caution slowly hardened into structural conservatism, shaping outcomes before alternatives could even be considered. Institutions adjusted their incentives accordingly. Managers were rewarded for consistency, not vision. Deviating from established patterns carried career risk, even when the potential upside was substantial. In this environment, doing nothing often felt safer than doing something new. Preservation became a strategy. Markets mirrored this behavior. Capital clustered around familiar names and proven models. New entrants faced steep barriers, not because they lacked merit, but because they lacked history. The system favored what could be measured, audited, and forecasted. Ambiguity became suspect. Originality became expensive. The emotional tension surfaced in missed moments. Opportunities that passed quietly. Technologies that matured elsewhere. Entire sectors that grew slower than they might have. None of these failures triggered alarms. There was no collapse to force attention, but the accumulation mattered. This was the early conflict deepening. Safety was delivering stability, but it was also dampening momentum. The system could endure stress, yet it struggled to generate transformation. Progress became incremental by design. Supporters argued this was the cost of maturity, that an economy built to last must accept fewer breakthroughs in exchange for fewer disasters. Critics warned that without experimentation, even stable systems eventually fall behind. Both perspectives carried truth, and neither could be ignored. The reveal sharpened. Risk had not been eliminated. It had been redefined as something to be minimized everywhere rather than managed selectively. And in doing so, the system reduced its own adaptability. The tension was no longer abstract. It was visible in the gap between what was safe and what was possible. And that gap was growing. The pressure reached its emotional peak when the limits of safety became impossible to ignore. The system was stable, but it was also slow, protected, but cautious to the point of hesitation. And in a world that continued to change, hesitation carried its own risks. Industries began to feel outpaced. Competitors operating outside the most regulated spaces moved faster, experimenting freely and adapting quickly. Meanwhile, institutions bound by safety-first logic struggled to respond. Their strength lay in endurance, not agility, and endurance alone could not guarantee relevance. Inside boardrooms, the tension was palpable. Leaders understood the need for innovation, yet felt constrained by frameworks that punished deviation. Every bold move required layers of justification. Every new idea faced resistance rooted not in fear of failure, but fear of consequence. Risk had become personal. This was the emotional conflict at the heart of the system. Safety had reduced collective danger, but it had transferred pressure onto individuals. Those who chose to take risks bore disproportionate responsibility if outcomes disappointed. In such an environment, restraint became rational, even when it undermined progress. Markets reflected the strain. Growth appeared steady but muted. Breakthroughs became rarer. The economy moved forward, but cautiously, as if testing each step before committing weight. Stability was holding, but it was holding everything in place. The reveal became clear. A system that avoids risk too completely does not eliminate danger. It changes its form. The risk shifts from sudden collapse to gradual irrelevance, from dramatic failure to slow erosion. The buildup was complete. The question facing the system was no longer about protection. It was about direction. Could safety coexist with boldness? Or had risk been pushed so far away that progress itself was becoming the casualty? The answer would shape what came next. The resolution arrived through a gradual shift in thinking rather than a dramatic break. The system began to recognize that safety and risk were not opposites, but complements. Protection could not mean paralysis. Stability could not mean stillness. To remain relevant, the system had to relearn how to move. The climax revealed a simple but uncomfortable truth. Avoiding risk entirely does not create a safer future. It creates a narrower one, a future where opportunities are filtered out before they can mature, where progress arrives late, if at all. Safety had done its job, but it could not be the final destination. Slowly, space was reopened for calculated risk, not reckless exposure, but intentional uncertainty. Frameworks evolved to distinguish between danger that threatened collapse and risk that enabled growth. Institutions learned to tolerate experimentation within boundaries rather than suppress it entirely. The resolution reshaped behavior. Leaders were encouraged to think beyond preservation. Incentives adjusted to reward long-term value, not just short-term safety. The system did not abandon caution, but it stopped letting caution dictate every decision. What emerged was a more balanced approach. Stability became the foundation, not the ceiling. Risk returned as a tool rather than an enemy. The economy regained its capacity to adapt, not by dismantling protection, but by remembering why progress requires exposure. The lesson endured. A system that survives but cannot evolve eventually fails in quieter ways. Safety must protect the future, not freeze the present, because progress has always required stepping forward before certainty arrives. Subscribe to join the journey. What